In these quiet suburban pockets like Wexler Grove, everything looks straight out of a real estate brochure. Manicured lawns rolling like green carpet, white fences gleaming under perfect Texas sun, and that big HOA welcome sign at the gate promising community harmony in bold letters that somehow always feel like a threat. But scratch the surface, and it's a pressure cooker of rules so absurd they'd make a prison warden blush. No flag up past Memorial Day. Grass exactly 2.5 inches. Garden gnomes? Tacky and subject to fine. And at the heart of it all, keeping the whole place from falling apart without ever asking for credit, was Eleanor Caslon. She'd been there since the first slab was poured in 2009, the silent ghost who knew every sprinkler head, every valve, every hidden camera feed. Residents just called her the maintenance lady when their pool turned green or the gate jammed at rush hour. Eleanor never raised her voice. She showed up at dawn, fixed what needed fixing, and vanished before anyone could pat her on the back. She'd personally overseen the 2011 upgrade that wired the entire community. Smart irrigation, automated gates, clubhouse HVAC, pool filtration, security system, tied neatly to the original land trust nobody ever read past the first page. Back then, the developers had called her the blueprint ghost. She didn't need a title. She just knew where the real power flowed. Then, Karen Vossler happened. Freshly elected HOA president after a campaign that was basically a TED Talk on modern standards, Karen arrived like she owned the place. Yoga pants, clipboard, and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Her first move? A glossy memo delivered to every door, full-color header with her smug face in the corner like a startup pitch. Community Optimization Initiative. Elevating synergy through rural modernization. Corporate poetry for we're about to screw the people who actually keep this place alive. Eleanor's name was missing from the new approved access list for the maintenance shed, the clubhouse control panels, even the irrigation app. She scanned the QR code out of curiosity. It redirected to some half-baked Notion board that wouldn't load on her phone. Amateurs. Eleanor didn't throw a fit. She simply continued her Tuesday walk through the same way she always had, checking the west side drainage slope for pooling, noting the chipped concrete at the pool deck, flagging the motion sensor on gate 3 that had been blinking red for 2 weeks straight. She'd built the specs for that entire flow system in 2011. No one questioned how she knew every voltage draw and pressure gauge by heart. They just enjoyed the perfect lawns and crystal clear pool. Up at the clubhouse, the new blood were already in full swing. One board member had a neon sign that read, "Enforce now, complain later." Another had a poster of some influencer photoshopped as a superhero. The air smelled of overpriced candles, kombucha, and the kind of ambition that had never met a consequence. Eleanor walked past without a word, noting the scratched baseboards, the swollen floor tiles, the subtle dip that meant the subfloor was rebelling again. Nobody saw it. Nobody cared. But she did. She always had. Back at her corner unit tucked behind the records archive in the community office, she logged into the maintenance portal like every Tuesday. The screen blinked. Access denied. Contact admin. Her credentials, the same ID she'd used since 2010, were gone. She refreshed. Same result. That's when she felt it. Not anger, not even surprise, just that quiet click in the chest when you realize the game is already in motion and someone thinks they're the only player. She opened her bottom drawer and pulled out a single yellowed sheet, laser printed in 2009 under her attorney's letterhead. Caslon Trust Property Agreement, Wexler Grove site. The original signed, notarized, buried so deep under corporate layers that most people thought the land belonged to the HOA itself. It didn't. It never had. They managed the amenities. She owned the dirt. Every square inch beneath their perfect lawns, their Instagram-worthy pools, and their ridiculous gnome debates was hers. Karen didn't know that, of course. She saw Eleanor as the dowdy maintenance lady who didn't wear heels or host wine nights. Eleanor fixed things silently, permanently, and she'd kept it that way for 15 years. But something about that glossy memo, the casual arrogance of it, shifted the balance. Karen hadn't just tripped a wire. She'd yanked the whole fuse box. Eleanor folded the document back into its protective sleeve, slid it in her leather satchel, and stood up. She walked to the window, overlooking the main boulevard. Crisp morning, blue skies, not a cloud in sight. Perfect weather for demolition. Not the loud kind. The kind you never hear coming. The kind that starts with one quiet text. Karen Vossler strutted toward Eleanor's unit like she was walking onto a TED stage. Pink polo unbuttoned, just enough to show off a fake tan, and a gold HOA pin that probably came from Amazon. She had backup. 2 board members cradling iPads like shields, fingers poised over notes they'd never actually read. One looked like she was still figuring out how to hold eye contact. The other was already filming for the transparency reel. Karen cleared her throat like she was about to drop the mic. "Time pack it in, Eleanor," she said with a half laugh that expected applause. "We need fresh energy here. No offense, honey, but this community has that legacy aroma." Eleanor didn't blink. No screaming, no HR, not even the courtesy of a proper vote. Just vibes and a woman with an inflated title who called herself Director of Community Transformation on the HOA Facebook page. She mistook Eleanor's silence for fear. Rookie mistake. Eleanor stood, not fast, not slow, just the same calm way you'd stand if you saw a storm rolling in over land you protected for 15 years and knew exactly where every floodgate sat. She turned to the window. Same view she'd studied every morning for a decade and a half. The oak by the main gate that somehow still stood. The north lot. The perfect rows of houses that all rested on her dirt. "Understood," she said, soft as a closing drawer. Behind her, one board member shifted awkwardly. The other lowered her phone. Eleanor pulled out her cell. No panic, no performance. She opened the single contact labeled Stone and Maynard LLP, her attorneys on retainer since the trust was formed. 2 words, trigger clause. Sent. That was it. Karen opened her mouth for the final rehearsed zinger she'd probably practiced in the mirror while touching up her contour, but Eleanor was already reaching for her jacket. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. Her eyes drifted to the far wall of the community office, the one Karen had clearly never noticed. Right above the printer hung a framed black and white photo. At first glance, it looked like a vintage development shot. The plaque below read everything. Wexler Grove Site Redevelopment in Trust, March 2009, Caslon Holdings. Karen had never once asked what Caslon Holdings was. Never Googled it. Never wondered why it was the only name on the original approvals. She thought the gates opened because her daddy's connections cut a check. She never thought to ask who owned the ground beneath her perfect 2.5-inch grass. Eleanor took one last precise look around her space. The bookshelf she installed herself. The ceiling patch she reworked after the 2012 storm. The emergency light she rerouted during the blackout. It was all still hers, even if the paperwork didn't scream it in bold letters. Ownership wasn't about titles. It was about leverage, foresight, long games that women like Karen couldn't even spell. "Need help carrying your things?" Karen asked, suddenly trying to sound helpful like she'd just gifted early retirement. Eleanor finally turned, just enough to meet her eyes. "I think you're going to need maintenance more than I will," she said quietly. Karen furrowed her brow, unsure if it was a threat or friendly advice. Eleanor walked out, left the chair, turned slightly, blinds open, everything exactly as it had been. She passed the front gate guard. He nodded. She nodded back. He'd seen enough over the years to know when to stay quiet. By the time she reached her car, her phone pinged. "Lawyer, received. Filing under Clause 7.4b at 11 a.m. Eleanor sat behind the wheel. Let the silence settle. No music, no radio, just the quiet hum of a woman who'd been underestimated so long people forgot she helped build the very streets they drove on. The prodigy president had made her move. Now it was Eleanor's turn. Karen was mid-sentence in the clubhouse, and once we eliminate redundant legacy assets when the deputy walked in. She froze. Not because of the uniform, but because real authority walks differently than iPad warriors. No swagger, just heavy grounded steps that made even the boldest Karen feel the floor shift beneath her Lululemon feet. The sheriff's deputy was calm, mid-50s, clip-on tie, polished boots, face like he'd seen every flavor of bad decision a Tuesday could serve. He held a sealed envelope and didn't bother asking for Karen by name. He already knew who the loudest voice in the room was. "Mrs. Vossler," he said evenly. "This is for you and the entire community." Karen took it with a confused laugh, as if Ashton Kutcher might pop out yelling punked. She sliced the seal with a manicured nail and scanned the letter. Her smile faded like cell reception in a dead zone. Clause 7.4b. In the event the trust's on-site representative is removed without prior consultation and documented board resolution, the trust reserves the right to revoke site occupancy with 30 days' notice. Waiver rights reserved exclusively by truster. Translation: you targeted the wrong woman and now you're trespassing on her dirt. Karen tried to stammer something about consulting legal. The deputy cut her off gently, like a surgeon ignoring a patient mid-surgery. The community amenities are under temporary injunction pending review. Effective immediately, that includes operational freeze on all resident access until further directive. One board member dropped her iPad. Someone in the back whispered, "Is this real?" It was. By 12:30, every badge code across the gates had suspended. The clubhouse doors blinked dark. Emails to the HOA portal bounced. Printers stopped mid-page. Only emergency lighting remained, and even that flickered like it knew something was dying. The HOA tried to bluff. Must be a clerical error. But the deputy had backup now. Second envelope for the community manager, heavier, full of notarized exhibits and the original trust deed appendices that hadn't seen daylight since the first house was framed. Eleanor's lawyer had filed it all within 50 minutes of her text. It didn't need to dig. Clause 7.4b had been renewed annually like clockwork, right alongside the property taxes Eleanor paid without fanfare. It sat in the same vault drawer as the original schematics, fire safety codes, and the EPA drainage audit she personally reviewed in 2013. It wasn't a threat. It was a fuse. And Karen, bless her disruptor heart, had struck the match with both hands. Down at the main gate, security started redirecting cars. Moms with lunch still warm in their hands, confused, dialing board members who couldn't get past the turnstiles. One new resident posted to the community Facebook, "Wexler Grove is literally locked. What is happening?" 3 crying emojis and the caption, "They won't even let us get the mail." Karen tried calling from her mobile hotspot, probably her lawyer dad or some friend with a real estate license and 0 actual hours. It didn't matter. The clause was filed, logged, accepted by the county, time-stamped, and already stamped with the judge's signature. Amenities frozen. Utilities under review. Management contract suspended. Up in the records vault. Yes, the actual physical vault, because some of us still believe in paper. Eleanor's original trust agreement sat in steel box number 271. Same slot for 14 years. No dust. Just quietly waiting to be respected. Back at her home office, Eleanor poured herself coffee and flipped through a spreadsheet. One column showed projected vacancy estimates for suburban communities across the metro area. The next column listed her redevelopment contacts. Karen wanted modernization. She was about to learn what transformation really looked like. And it started with erasing her control one clause at a time. By Friday, the community had started to hum. Not dramatic at first, just subtle. The security gate at the main entrance stalled mid-open, forcing a line of SUVs to back up into the street. The pool filtration system lagged, then reset entirely, turning the once crystal water a suspicious shade of green. The clubhouse HVAC started blowing cold into warm zones and warm into cold ones. On the east side, someone joked it was like the neighborhood caught a virus. It had, and Eleanor was the carrier. What none of Karen's modern standards crew understood, because they never bothered reading anything built before TikTok, was that during the 2011 upgrade, every system connected to life safety, power, environmental control, and digital routing had been tied by contract and code to landowner permissions. At the time, it was hailed as a forward-thinking partnership. In practice, it made Eleanor the root admin of their entire operational nervous system. By noon, no one could badge into the maintenance shed. By 1:15, the clubhouse doors were dead. Automatic calendar displays blinked offline. Smart glass windows on the community center stayed opaque, trapping the board in boxy gray silence. The espresso machine in the clubhouse stopped dispensing. Microwaves reset. Even the fridges in the snack area began thawing their overpriced kombucha supply. One resident reportedly wept over melted organic yogurt. Karen tried to hold a crisis meeting in her favorite war room, only to find the doors literally locked. The digital panel blinked red, then died. She called building services. No one answered. She sent 3 urgent texts to the property liaison. They bounced. Finally, an old-timer who hadn't been iced out yet walked up quietly and said, "There is no more building services department." It was absorbed into Caslon Trust in 2020. Karen blinked. What the hell is Caslon Trust? That was the moment it clicked. Not just for her, but for the entire board and the residents who had ridden the wave of HOA arrogance without ever checking who held the shoreline. Caslon Trust wasn't a name. It was the foundation. And it was Eleanor's. By 3 p.m., a strange new Wi-Fi network had replaced the old Wexler Secure. Gone was the familiar signal. In its place across every device appeared eviction mode _trustnet. No password. Just an open HTML splash page. Access to this facility is under review by Caslon Trust per Article 7.4b. All systems governed by Primary Infrastructure Agreement 2011 revision. Contact your legal team. Someone tried unplugging the router panel. It rebooted with the same message, now on a 60-second loop. Residents started leaving in clumps, whispering, packing up. One mom muttered, "I don't get paid enough for whatever this HOA mess is." Karen stayed, of course. Pacing the powerless clubhouse, hair mussed, still trying to act like the protagonist in a redemption arc nobody wanted to watch. She tried calling Eleanor's lawyer, redirected to the trust inquiry portal. She tried filing a formal challenge with the county, already declined 3 hours earlier. She tried rebooting the emergency power grid manually. That's when the lights went out completely. Back in her living room, Eleanor was watching a rerun of Columbo and sipping Earl Grey. Her phone pinged with a security update. System lockdown complete. Phase 1 response executed. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The storm wasn't coming. It was already inside. And the woman in charge had just learned what happens when you target the architect of your air supply. They met at 10 a.m. sharp that Saturday, desperate enough to skip their usual brunches. Some dialed in from vacation homes. Others sat red-eyed in the now powerless clubhouse, glass walls steamed from lack of climate control, bottled water, dead laptops, and the unmistakable smell of panic in designer perfume. Eleanor wasn't invited. She didn't need to be. The meeting opened with finger-pointing. They blamed maintenance. Maintenance blamed legacy infrastructure. Marketing muttered something about optics. And Karen, sweating through her quarter zip that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire filing cabinet, launched into a breathless rant about transitional resistance from outdated stakeholders. She called Eleanor a squatter, a disgruntled retiree clinging to legacy rights like a barnacle. That's when the real lawyer finally spoke, cleared her throat. Deed page 38. Quiet. Surgical. No raised voices. The room stilled. She clicked a file and mirrored it to the one working tablet. There, scanned in high resolution and stamped with the county seal, was Eleanor's signature alongside the original developers, 2 witnesses, a notary dated 2009. It wasn't a favor. It was a legally binding clause buried in the foundational agreements the board had ratified in a rush when they needed last-minute financing. It read in part, "In the event of unauthorized removal, exclusion, or reassignment of the trust's designated representative without formal consultation. The trust may at their sole discretion revoke site usage. No contestation clause applies. Reinstatement requires written consent of truster. In plain English, they messed with the wrong woman, and Eleanor didn't need anyone's permission to pull the land out from under them. Karen opened her mouth. The lawyer held up a hand. It's enforceable. It's live. You activated it. Someone asked if there was a digital copy. She nodded. Yes, but we found the original this morning. She reached into her briefcase and set the thick sealed envelope on the table like a blackjack hand nobody wanted. Flipped, notarized, laminated, vault stored since day one. Karen's voice cracked. Why didn't anyone flag this? A board member who actually remembered the original deal leaned forward. Because no one ever expected you'd be dumb enough to trigger it. Silence followed. Thick, the kind that makes women with clipboards wonder how long they've been living inside a paper throne. Someone muttered, "What happens now?" The lawyer answered without emotion. Technically, the community is in breach. Truster has full authority to reassign amenities, reclaim infrastructure, or invoke redevelopment. Unless she waives the clause, this site is functionally in default. Karen tried to deflect again, offering some line about positive intent and generational miscommunication. The board wasn't buying it. Not after watching the gates lock, the pool turn swamp, and their emails bounce into oblivion. Not after learning that everything they thought they controlled, heating, wiring, water flow, even the damn known policy, was tied to agreements they never read. They ended the meeting without resolution. No plan, no vote, just a shared understanding that the ground beneath their perfect lawns had shifted and the woman they'd underestimated was already 10 steps ahead. Meanwhile, Eleanor was repotting her hydrangeas, not because she was indifferent, but because she'd already done the hard part. The deed clause wasn't a weapon. It was insurance written in the ink of foresight, protected by time and immune to apology. Let them scramble. Let them debate. The only signature that mattered now was hers. The locksmith arrived before sunrise. Not one of those cartoon key vans. This guy wore a city-issued badge and had a silent, heavy step like he'd done this before. His toolbox hit the marble clubhouse floor with a sound that made 2 residents drop their lattes. He didn't speak, just nodded at the sheriff, then knelt to begin removing the main cylinder locks from every entrance. By 8:15 a.m., uniformed officers stood at every gate. The notice had gone out at dawn. All non-essential access suspended. Residents had 2 hours to retrieve personal items. Community property would remain sealed, cataloged, and subjected to arbitration pending formal review. No exceptions. The mom who ran the book club cried quietly in the stairwell as she boxed up her framed quotes and desk cactus. One dad tried to sneak a full monitor under his coat until the officer shook his head once and pointed to the exit. Karen wasn't there. She hadn't shown up, but her office door, still locked and still powerless, sat with a bright red sticker. Access suspended per Article 7.4b. Revocation in progress. Upstairs, the lawyer packed in silence. The HOA fielded desperate questions from residents, trying to figure out where their dues would go now. One woman muttered something about insurance, then trailed off as the locksmith passed her in the hallway. On the mezzanine, the social media team tried to stage a goodbye selfie by the neon Wexler Grove sign. The power cut out halfway through. One senior board member stood by the delivery dock, staring at the sun, watching a branded truck arrive with new standing desks and recycled wood acoustic panels scheduled weeks ago. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, confused. "Wait, why are you guys moving out? I thought you just hit some big milestone." The board member just stared, then quietly said, "We don't own the dirt." The driver blinked. "What?" "The land," he repeated a little louder. "We manage the community." The land was never ours. No one answered after that. Back across town, Eleanor sat at her usual diner, corner booth, black coffee, 2 eggs over hard on rye toast. She didn't check the news feed. She didn't refresh the filing dashboard. The deed was done, both legally and literally. Her name sat on file and the county records clear as sunrise. Caslon Trust, primary landholder. Site usage under revocation. The waitress, Nancy, topped off her cup and smiled. You look like someone who just won a long game. Eleanor gave her a small nod. Just finishing one. On the sidewalk outside, two pigeons fought over a chunk of bagel. In a boardroom 6 miles away, a dozen executives were learning that brand loyalty, rule enforcement, and HOA vision mean very little when the land under your ping-pong tables is no longer yours to stand on. At 10 a.m., the final buzzer sounded through Wexler Grove. Law enforcement swept the halls once. Then the locksmith re-engaged the cylinders one by one. The glass doors closed. Lights dimmed. A single sign remained taped to the main gate, printed in plain Arial black ink. Closed pending reassignment per Article 7.4b, Caslon Trust. No logos. No drama. Just authority. They had built their little empire on someone else's foundation. And now they've been reminded what happens when the ground decides it's done holding you up. They brought in a fancy law firm by Tuesday. Big name, bigger invoices. The goal was simple. Unravel the revocation. Find any thread to call the clause into question. But legal leverage doesn't come from volume. It comes from maintenance. And Eleanor had maintained everything. They requested public records only to find the trust was in perfect standing. Taxes filed every year on time. No extensions. Permits updated and archived. The last renewal time-stamped 6 months ago with a city clerk's signature. They even pulled building code logs and couldn't find a single lapse. That's the thing about being underestimated. Nobody thinks you're thorough. They assume you got lucky. They never imagine you have binders thicker than their case files and backup drives stored in a fireproof safe labeled redundancy. By Thursday, the tone shifted. No more smug emails. Just quiet conference calls and a mounting pile of printouts that all ended the same way. Caslon Trust. Valid, enforceable, bulletproof. Some poor junior associate got the job of reviewing the physical deed book. Between the last renewal tab and the contract summary sheet, they found something taped to the inside of the back cover. A letter printed on thick linen paper from the original developer. To the future holder of this site, never forget who stabilized your footing when the foundation cracked. Pinned beneath it, a copy of the transfer log with Eleanor's neat initials. The fancy law firm didn't even try to refute it. Their lead counsel just filed an internal memo with 2 words in the subject line, irrevocable standing. The board stopped replying to Karen's emails. Her assistant resigned quietly. No farewell post, just a final message that read, "Hope you kept the receipt for your HOA presidency." Karen didn't log into the community page for days. When she finally did, the only update was the removal of her title and "open to new opportunities" engraved beneath her profile picture. She tried calling Eleanor twice. No answer. There wasn't anything left to discuss. The community was sealed. The clause enforced. The trust intact. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 12 days after the locks changed. Eleanor was in her garden, pruning the roses before the first cold snap. The phone buzzed once. Unknown number, but the area code told her enough. She wiped her hands on a towel and answered without ceremony. "Hello, MS. Caslon. This is Darren Langford, former HOA board chair. I believe we've had some unfortunate misunderstandings." He paused like he was still deciding which version of himself to use. "I didn't know the management agreement had this kind of language." "It always did," Eleanor replied, calm, factual, not cruel. He sighed. "I'm not here to justify what happened. I've spoken with legal. I understand the enforceability." He didn't say Karen's name, probably still figuring out how to explain to the residents that their president had disrupted herself straight into community eviction. "I just wondered," he continued, "if you might be open to a restructured agreement. Different leadership, new management company, separate entity. We're exploring options." Eleanor let a few seconds pass. Not on that site. He was quiet. She could hear the faint hum of fluorescent lights and maybe even a coffee machine behind him. Corporate limbo always sounds the same. "Well, He cleared his throat. I understand, and I respect your position. I'm glad to hear that, Eleanor said. He hesitated again. We're operating out of a temporary location now. Rented space, third-party facilities. It's not ideal. We're sharing walls with a call center that sells extended warranties. He laughed, a short, defeated sound. Eleanor let the image settle. Well, Darren, I do know someone developing a new community near South Point. Better zoning, no legacy wiring, sustainable materials. They're looking for anchor residents. He perked up. Really? That could be they'll need a different pitch deck, Eleanor said evenly. A more humble one. Understood. And they'll want to see your internal governance plan in full before they sign anything. Of course. I'll make the introduction, she said, but only that. He nodded into the phone. Thank you, MS. Caslon. Eleanor into the call. Didn't save the number. Didn't smile. Just knelt back down beside the rose bush and resumed clipping. The silence was comfortable again. Earned. Across town, Darren prepared to pitch residents from a folding table in a converted mail room with thin walls and a shared bathroom. He still had his business cards. But he no longer had footing, because footing isn't an idea. It's a deed. And in his case, the deed no longer said Wexler Grove. It said Caslon, which for people like him is the kind of detail they only notice once they're standing outside, trying to badge into a gate that doesn't recognize them anymore. 3 months to the day the community came back online. No ribbon cutting, no overproduced launch with drones and espresso carts. Just a clean install of new infrastructure, new management, and an entirely different energy. The space was leased to a quiet homeowners group focused on smart systems and resilient communities, the kind of people who read every clause before they sign. They didn't ask for naming rights. They just signed, moved in, and began working. Efficient, grateful, intentional. The front signage was updated with a new brass plate mounted flush with the limestone. Property managed by Caslon Trust. Site use governed by Articles 7 to 9. Terms non-negotiable. The font wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It was there to remind. One of the new partners asked if Eleanor would consider attending their winter gathering as an honorary guest. She accepted out of curiosity more than vanity. The space had been transformed, walls reconfigured, floors stripped and redone in reclaimed oak, lighting replaced with warm LEDs that made the place feel more like a neighborhood than a monument to rules. At the gathering, the mayor gave a short, genial speech about innovation built on integrity. Then she smiled, raised her glass, and said with a chuckle, "And let this be a reminder. Never cross the woman who owns the ground beneath your unicorn." The room laughed politely. A few heads turned toward Eleanor. She didn't speak, didn't correct her, just raised her glass slightly, took a sip, and let the silence say what needed saying. Afterward, as she stood by the east window, watching the city pulse in amber and blue beyond the glass, one of the younger board members approached. He asked quietly, "How did you know to keep it all so airtight?" Eleanor looked at him, not unkindly, and said, "Because when people stop looking at the foundation, that's when the cracks start forming. I just made sure mine never shifted." He nodded slowly. You could see it landing. Later that night, as she gathered her coat and slipped out into the cold, she passed the plaque again. Its metal surface caught the light from the courtyard torches just enough to glow faintly. She didn't stop, didn't touch it. But as she walked away, she thought about all the time she'd been dismissed as background, maintenance, legacy asset. Thought about the women in pressed polos who thought leverage came from noise. It doesn't. Leverage isn't about volume. It's about foundation.